We're going to focus our remarks today on 3 of the topics that are found in that black banner that's on every page in our website, and they include health, and education, and economy and workforce. Obviously, these topics, they affect everyone in this room here. I'm going to talk about the key trends that we see in those areas. But before I do so, I want to start with demographics. The reason we do so is because none of those areas are unaffected by the demographics in our state. In layman's terms, demographics simply means who we are, where we came from, where do we live, how many of us there are, and where we're going, how many of us there will be. And really, this affects all of those topics. Where I want to begin is talking about the aging of our state. We've certainly heard a lot about this, but it bears repeating because, as Steve was saying, there's a freight train coming. Things are going to change dramatically. What you see here is a graph on our site that shows from the oldest to the very youngest in 5-year increments our whole population distribution. And the group that's circled there are those folks who were 45 to 54 years old in 2010. Probably a few of us in the room here. They're the late wave baby boomers. And in each of those bars, there's more than 400,000 people. And that's more than anyone who's gone before them and anyone who will follow. And that is so significant. We have to remember this because as these groups age, as you can imagine this going upward, kind of like an escalator, that's going to change, again, the whole structure of our society. Already, in 2000, our median age in our state was 35 years old. And in 2010, it rose to 37 years. Now you might think, well, hey, that's a pretty good deal. 10 years went by and we only got 2 years older. I'd really like to get in on that. But what it underscores is that not only are we aging individually, but collectively. We are getting older and getting older quickly. As we look out across the state, already, 22 counties of our state, 1 in 5 of the residents there are over age 65. This is in 2010. This is how quickly that's going to change. By 2020, it will be 48 counties, shown in the blue. And by 2030, 69 of our 87 counties will have more than 1 in 5 of their residents over age 65. And most of those in the gray here are at about 19%, so they just missed the cut. So really dramatic change, very rapid, is going to be upon us. As you can see here in the metro, we're a little bit younger, but we're all heading in the same direction. Now, what does this look like over time? Here we have just the major age groups. And if you look here in 2020, which I'd like to remind you is just about 8 years away, something is going to happen that's never happened in the history of our state. We're going to have our 65-plus population outnumber our school-age population. It will eclipse that group for the first time in our state's history. And meanwhile, this higher line, our workforce is going to level off and then decline relative to these groups. So that is dramatic. That certainly changes our workforce. It's going to change all of these topics we're discussing today. Here's another way to look at that graphically. If we think about the typical working age population, shown in blue below this line here, there's about 5 of those folks for every person of typical retirement age. Very shortly, it will be 1 to 3. So a dramatic shift by 2030. And so without dramatic increases also in our productivity, we're going to have a hard time maintaining economic growth with such a reduced workforce. What does this mean? Well, if we are going to be competitive around the country, around the nation, we absolutely need to develop, retain, and attract workers. I don't think I could have made the case any better than Steve just did. But let me add to that if we're going to do that, we cannot continue to have roughly half of our students of color not graduate from high school on time. We just cannot do it before we even begin to talk about higher ed. As you think about that age structure from oldest to youngest in our state, it's important to note we look really different at the top and the bottom. The 85 plus group, about 3% of them are people of color. When we look at the under 5 population, it's 31%. Now imagine in just 20 years, these kids are going to be entering the workforce. And will we have done what we need to do to prepare them? Are we going to be ready for them? And it's important because they really are driving the growth in our state's population. If we look over the decade here, we look back to 2000, nearly all of the growth in our state is from our populations of color. 53% growth in those populations. We outpaced even the US. Meanwhile, our white population has only grown 2%, pretty even. And to unpack that a little bit for you, what we see here is in 1990, things began to change really dramatically. The top 3 lines in this graph are Asian, Black, and Hispanic populations, which have either tripled or quadrupled since 1990. But of course, our changing diversity, our demographics, they look really different across the state. Different, of course, if you are perhaps out in Traverse County, or different maybe if you're a Karen refugee in the St. Paul public school system. So one of the benefits of Compass is we can take both a wide-angle lens on a problem, on a situation, and also put it under a microscope, look at it differently. Here's some ways that we look at our changing demographics. What you see here is that these things are experienced really differently depending upon where you are. This map shows just our under 20 population, our children. And in 2 counties, Nobles and Watonwan County, 1 in 3 of the kids are Hispanic. Looks very different in those counties. And here in Ramsey County, 1 in 5 of our children are Asian, 1 in 5. In places like Brooklyn Park and Brooklyn Center, more than half of the residents are people of color. And 1 in 4 residents in certain cities around our state are people of color. Places you might not expect. Places like Burnsville, Shakopee, Fridley, New Hope, Woodbury, and of course Minneapolis and St. Paul. More than 1 in 4 residents is a person of color. So we're changing really dramatically. Of course, a lot of the change is due to our immigrant population. Again, in 1990, things began to take off. They look really different, and we had growth in our population, both in numbers and percent, of foreign-born populations. So right now, we have 1 in 10 of our residents in the Twin Cities who is an immigrant, and that's not even counting their children who may be native-born. It's about 7% if you look out across the state. And here are the major groups. Many of them comprise our populations of color. Far and away, our largest group is from Mexico, almost 70,000 folks who were born there, but also significant representation from places like India. Keep them in mind, they're part of our Asian population. I think we overlooked them. Places like Somalia, Vietnam, Thailand, Ethiopia, China, Liberia, and about 12,000 folks from Canada, too. Probably the only ones on this list who may have come here for the weather. So I just want you to keep all of that in mind. That's just a rough sketch of our changing demographics. Think about those groups and those populations as we unpack the topics of health, education, and economy for the rest of this presentation and the rest of the day. I'm going to talk really briefly now about some of the things we're seeing in the health arena. First thing, obviously, it's been a very weak economy the last 3 years. Piece of good news is that we have largely hung on to our health care coverage. About 10% of our state's population is uninsured, under age 65, and that's remained constant over the last 3 years. So that positions us 4th best among all states. And I know that's a very proud tradition we have in Minnesota. We're very proud of what we have done for the health of our residents. And as we look at this graph, which shows by age from the youngest to the oldest, you see that our kids, there's a pretty small share of them who are uninsured, just 6 or 7% in those youngest age groups. And you might think, well, we're doing pretty well by our kids. But one of the benefits of Compass is that we can look at data in different ways. And the picture changes, it gets a little more complex. So if you recall, I said we were 4th best among all states in covering our under 65 population. But I bet you didn't know that over the last 3 years, we fell from 14th to 28th in the share of our kids that we cover with health insurance. We are middle of the pack now, and this has been a dramatic change. In places that we generally don't consider peer states, Places like West Virginia, Louisiana, New York, Alabama now cover more children with health insurance as a percent than we do in Minnesota. So our progress or our standing, and even indeed our prosperity, is relative to the rest of the US, to other places. And it certainly looks different by income and by race. Those folks who are in poverty in our state are twice as likely to not have health insurance. So they're both economically vulnerable and vulnerable in health. And more than 1 in 4 American Indians, Hispanics, and foreign-born blacks are also uninsured. Now briefly, I want to talk about obesity. Obesity is something that's been much in the media, and it's something we have data for back to 1995. And I think it's a real piece of good news that I can bring to you today. What you see here is that for Minnesota and the US, this has just been galloping upward since 1995, the percent of us who are obese in our state among the adult population. But something happened here in 2007, something we've been watching very closely, and we began to break away. This is the Minnesota line in green from the US. And so we have flattened the line. Over the last several years, we have not seen any rise in the percent of our residents who are obese. And that is certainly good news that I can bring to you today. I'm sure it's welcome news to folks at state and local health departments, folks working on the SHIP initiatives around the state. But nonetheless, we still have 1 in 4 residents who are obese. And this is significant in terms of personal and public costs. So for the future, as we look out, we have to do more than flatten the line. We have to reverse the trend. Related to that, what's going on with the diabetes rate, which has been edging up slowly but surely. It now stands at 7%, or about 270,000 Minnesotans. And these are thorny public health issues. They're big challenges, of course, and there are a lot of ways to attack these issues. I know we're excited about the Decade of Discovery that was announced, the partnership between Mayo and U of M to combat diabetes in the next decade. But perhaps you might be surprised that on Compass, we have data that also shows one of the ways you can fight obesity and diabetes is you can go to college. We have data by educational attainment that shows through a variety of ways, a variety of pathways, those folks who go on to higher ed are less likely to be obese. And they're less likely to have diabetes. So one final thing I want to talk about, obviously these are tremendous public health challenges, but it's much easier to start healthy and maintain our health than to try and bend the curve on some of these issues. So just checking in with our very youngest citizens. We've seen an economic impact. 3,000 fewer babies have been born in the last few years in the weak economy, but those who have been born healthier. So over the past 2 years, we've seen in numbers and both percent fewer low birth weight babies after a 20-year high that we hit. And why is that important? Well, these kids who are born at low birth weight, they're more likely to have health and learning challenges in childhood. They're more likely to have heart disease and diabetes in adulthood. So if we can start healthy, we can do a better job of remaining healthy. Finally, the last thing I want to say is about disability data that we have on our site. The aging of our population alone is going to mean that we'll have, if things just remain constant, 20% more individuals in the community who have self-report that they have disabilities, something that limits their daily functioning. But perhaps the most interesting and even disturbing graph that I've seen on Compass this year, when we look at disability among the working age population, we see two groups, both our American Indian and US-born Black populations, that have very high rates of disability. And certainly this affects their employment prospects, both securing and maintaining a job. So again, we see how health relates to economic prospects. And you see in your Compass Points brochure on your tables there, we have between whites and US-born Blacks the largest gap in unemployment participation of any state that has data. So certainly something we need to address.